Hey, hello. Hello. Hi, okay, so welcome to this panel. It is on creative salaries laid bare and the tangible steps to equal pay. And so with me, I have Edwina from Major Players and Isabel from Creative Mentor Network. And we're going to start with the Major Players salary survey.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Eddie, obviously from Major Players. I suppose I'll just introduce Major Players for those of you that don't know who Major Players are, but we are the UK's leading talent agency across creative industries. I suppose our salary survey is always really sought after because we've got the widest benchmarking across all of the creative industries. You know, I think with this particular salary survey, it's been really interesting because we've not only done salary benchmarking, but we've also done a lot of demographic data to go along with it. And I think with the roller coaster that we've had with the global pandemic and everything, it's really highlighted a lot of inequalities, which has been really obvious to a lot of us, but now it's actually seeing it in black and white and how we can then make changes to move forward, basically. There's a couple of key points on our salary survey that I've got up on the slide that I'll leave up for a couple of people to see. I suppose it's not the best news to see some of this data, but again, I think it's really important for us to see it, to know what we need to change for us all to move forward. So yeah, that's about it really. And obviously if you would like a copy of our salary survey, then reach out to us at the end and I can get you a copy as well.
Okay, so first question is to you both. What does equal pay in the creative industry look like? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first. I mean, for me, it's just as much about equal pay for the same work. So if you're doing the same job as someone or you're at the same level. But I think more than that, it's about equal routes to progression. And it's about fair access to promotions and to salary increases. So yeah, it's just as much about the work and the pay as it is about progression.
Yeah, pretty much agree. I think it's really obvious that people should be paid based on their experience and, you know, their actual experience in the role moving forward, regardless of, you know, background and stuff like that as well. So everyone should just be paid equally.
Okay, and so according to the survey, women earn around £10,000 less than men in permanent roles. So what can and what is being done to challenge this?
I'm gonna defer to Edwina on this because I guess I'm coming at it from the perspective of socioeconomic and diversity, but you probably know more about gender.
Yes, I think one thing that Major Players has been doing over the last 3 years is Earn Your Worth campaign, which is a campaign that we feel really strongly about. So we're actually not asking any of our candidates what their current salary is. We're only putting candidates forward based on what their worth is. So with that, I think from a candidate's perspective, it's really important to look at the data from salary surveys, talking to your peers, finding out, you know, what your salary is actually worth moving forward. I think from an employer's perspective, it's really interesting to look at companies with really clear salary bandings. We've got a couple of clients that do have clear salary bandings, so people know what their expectation is to move forward. I think across the creative industry, there is so much demand for female creatives at the moment, so I think it's also about hiring candidates based on their potential rather than their experience, and actually going through that journey with them to kind of upskill and get them to where they want to be as well.
Cool. And then I think leading on from that, we can talk about salary negotiation. So I think especially for women, they're told to negotiate like men, but then they're labelled as greedy or rude or whatever. So how can agencies ensure that they're not putting marginalised groups into like a double blind with that?
I think, again, it's not necessarily negotiating like a male. I think it's having the confidence and doing your research, doing your data, again, talking to your peers, getting as much information as you can so you have enough confidence to have those potentially quite awkward conversations with your line managers to ensure that you can be paid what you're worth moving forward. You know, I think that by doing that research, just having that confidence is just going to help you articulate those difficult conversations better.
Cool. Isabel, anything to
Yeah,
add?
I would think for, again, thinking about it from a socioeconomic perspective, I think there was some really interesting research that came out quite recently that an economist called Sam Friedman looked at socioeconomic diversity within the civil service, which sounds not too relevant, but I think it is actually really relevant. And what came out of that survey was some really interesting insights that those from more privileged backgrounds are much more capable, feel much more comfortable exploiting the kind of grey areas that exist within like that kind of negotiation. So overstating their involvement in certain projects, asking for pay rises, threatening to leave, all of those kind of things that are potentially part of negotiations. I think those from more privileged backgrounds who have greater confidence in those kind of the grey areas will find it much easier to negotiate. And I think it's being conscious of that and trying to set really clear parameters and clear structures around salary banding and open conversations about that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. And so talking about diversity, of course, there is an underrepresentation in the industry. So I think black women earn around £38,000 less compared to a white man's £58,000. So if that does affect you, how would you take the first steps to ensure that you're on a level playing field?
Yeah, I think, again, it's about kind of knowing your worth and trying to make sure that you're talking to people and making sure that you have the right support in place. I do it's so much about I think the focus for a long time has been very much about access to the creative industries, and more I think the conversation is shifting to be about progression, and I still don't feel like lots of organisations have in place the right structures of support to make sure that progression is an equal landscape, and that's things like training, access to mentors, really a whole suite of support so that people feel like they're not just going to leave, they don't need to leave the industry because they're not being fully recognised.
Yeah, I just think definitely agree with all of that, and just on the back of it, I also think it's almost kind of having that confidence to manage up to your manager at the same time, whether you have weekly, monthly, quarterly meetings set in with your manager, it's having clear expectations and guidelines on what you want to achieve and how to get there. Time and time again, we hear candidates wanting to leave roles because their managers don't have time to sit down and talk to them about what their progression is and where they need to be because they've had another meeting get put into their diary, they want to reschedule you. So I think, if they commit to having that time with you, you have to also have that confidence to ensure that they're going to be committed to sit down and have that time with you. And almost have a schedule of what you want to cover off in those individual meetings as well, I think would be really important.
I think also just to add to that, we're doing some really interesting work at the moment with Wyden Kennedy, where we're working with them on a kind of internal peer-to-peer mentoring scheme. So they noticed that they were spending kind of a lot of, they were making sure in significant numbers that they were recruiting at entry level some really diverse talent, and that was incredible, but they weren't able to keep that talent in the building. And so they've put some real, they're kind of strategically over the past few years are really trying to make sure that there are clear routes to progression for that talent. So the part of this, the work we're doing with them is about setting up those peer-to-peer relationships from a senior to a much more junior level. I think so often, sorry, I'm not speaking into the mic, so often it's once you've finished a kind of entry-level graduate scheme or non-graduate scheme or whatever scheme, and there's like a whole gamut of support around you, as soon as you graduate from that scheme, you're still very much in the early stages of your career, but perhaps that support completely falls off. So I think that's a really important thing, to be able to recognise that until you're kind of 5, 6, 7 years into your career, you probably still do need a lot of support to have those conversations, to understand what to ask for, to understand where the next move is. I also, within the creative sector, it's not, like management consultancy where there's like a really clear route and hierarchical structure to progression. There's so much lateral moving, job titles are often not that clear from the outside. It can be quite opaque, particularly if you're not someone who has connections within the industry, if you don't know anyone who works in it, and you don't have those informal relationships that you can lean on to kind of ask questions about where you should be or where you should be going. So again, like I think I've said the words formal support structures for progression or something like that about 3 times, but that for me is the really important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that kind of leads on to my next question, which is about those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who enter the industry and then may not stay because they're basically not showing that level of progression. So how can industry ensure that they attract those people but also retain them going forward?
Yeah, I think, sorry. The creative industries is actually performs really badly in terms of socioeconomic representation. I'm really sorry that I'm only talking from the perspective of socioeconomic, but that's just the world that I inhabit. But like it's something like within the sector, you're 2 times more likely to access higher paid jobs if you're from a more privileged background within the creative industries, and that's a third more the case in the creative sector than it is in the economy as a whole. So that's a confusing thing that I just said, sorry. But basically, the creative sector is much worse at socioeconomic diversity than the labour market as a whole. So I think that's quite significant, and I think we need to analyse why that is. For me, it's so much about access to the industry in terms of networks. It's hugely network. It's quite a fragmented labour market, so the recruitment is quite network driven. So if you don't know anyone, that's a problem. Also, careers education. I used to be a teacher, and careers education is shockingly shocking. I don't know if you guys would agree. Sorry, there are some of our mentees in the audience here, but you're nodding your heads. Careers education is pretty crap in the UK in state schools, and that needs to change. There's literally no awareness of what creative careers are. And I think then also there are so many sort of barriers at every stage. It's about career education, and then that investment in whether or not you do free. There's a kind of culture of working for free. I feel like I'm ranting a lot now, I'm really sorry, but there's a culture of working for free, and so, the more you, I think from the outside, it can be quite difficult to decide there is free work, which it's kind of maybe worth doing at the beginning of your career, but to understand which agencies it's worth, what's worth the investment is really tricky from the outside. I just feel like there are so many barriers, and that's a real problem that we need to tackle. Careers education is probably the number one thing.
I think just going on that, I know you mentioned obviously, there's a couple of pieces of, free placement work that you might want to do at the very beginning of your career. I personally think that that's a big no-no. I think unpaid placements just says more about the company that you're going to do that placement with than you wanting to gain that experience. I think the government, for example, they've got a minimum wage. London has a different minimum wage from that, just to highlight how expensive it is living in London. So the fact that any potential employer is not even willing to give you that, I would just avoid massively, to be totally honest. I think as well, just actually start talking more confidently about your background. I think there's so many organisations out there that you can kind of proactively go and join from a networking perspective. We've got Brixton Finishing School, there's 2020 Change. You can also go to places like She Says, which is massive. So I think if you're proactive out there, finding, people that you can speak to, even if you don't necessarily know them, it's about building that confidence, because so many people are there and willing to support you. It's for you to have that internal confidence to actually put yourself out there to get started.
Cool. And so moving on from junior to the more senior people in the industry, I believe 1 in 10 people on the Major Player Survey was over 45. So how can we ensure that those who are more senior still want to stay in the industry?
I think this is a really interesting question, and just I think because the creative industries is always about what's new, what's cool, what's trendy, and I think it's not a hugely attractive industry for someone who's potentially slightly older. I think a massive thing for females at that kind of slightly older age, the flexibility and hybrid working is going to be really important. So I think it's actually going to be a really interesting thing to see transition over the next 12 months, how some employers are going to really embrace that work from home or hybrid model moving forward. I've heard of a couple of companies recently that have always spoken the last 18 months about remote working, either fully remote, hybrid, whatever is better for you. Now things are kind of, the lights are turning back on, if so to speak. They're now saying, no, you must come back to the office 5 days a week. So we're having a lot of talent come to us looking for organisations that will offer that kind of flexibility. So I think that's one thing to actually retain that talent moving forward.
Yeah, I would just agree with that. I mean, I'm a new mother, and so I've just started to realise in a way that I ignorantly didn't how important flexible working is. And yeah, so I'm really thankful that with my board of trustees and my team have backed me enough to offer me the CEO role on a part-time basis, and I'm hoping that our organisation can continue to do the same for everyone that works for us. Actually, the last 2 people we've hired have come from agencies. Not the last 2 people. You're the last person. The last person and the person before that have come from agencies, and both have cited a kind of lack of work-life balance as a reason for leaving their previous job. So it's clearly having an effect on the talent that agencies are able to attract, and we're obviously the winners in that situation, but I think things do have to change.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Well, sorry, I was just going to add one more thing as well. I think, it's the whole silver pound thing that goes around, that age group actually spends the majority of money in the economy at the moment. And I just feel like the whole point of the creative industry is about advertising and doing campaigns to certain audiences. So it's going, how can you actually do a campaign to that audience if you don't have any talent in your organisation in that age category? So I think that's also something that a lot of companies need to consider as well.
Yeah, and then going back to what you said about flexible working, how will that impact pay then, do you think?
I think it could potentially impact the pay. I'd like to say that it wouldn't. I personally don't think it should. You should be paid on the work and the output that you do and you perform, regardless of where you live, how many times you go into the office. It's completely irrelevant as long as the output is still there. I have seen companies now changing contracts, taking pay cuts for people that want to be fully remote. Again, I think it's going to have to be a kind of wait and see, but unfortunately at the moment I would say it is probably going to have some impact on salary.
Anything to add?
No, nothing to add.
Okay, and so moving on to mentors in the industry, they are obviously so important, but I guess for those who don't have the ability to find a mentor and speak to one, what would they do to just get that kind of insight?
I think so. This is again where I think agencies and creative organisations taking the lead to make things positively structured in their organisations is really, really important. The research shows that those from more privileged backgrounds find it much easier to find kind of informal sponsors within their organisations and sponsors is kind of like a person who maybe advocates for you when you're not in the room, whereas a mentor can be someone who supports you one-to-one on specific areas that you're interested in progressing with. Those kind of levels of support, again, there are organisations out there that can offer you that support, and that's amazing. I would say that Creative Mentor Network is a really significant organisation within that field, and I would encourage anyone who's looking for a mentor to come and find us. But I do think that there's a role within the industry for organisations to set up really, really structured programs for those who don't necessarily have the informal networks to make those links. Again, so we're doing some work. We've been doing some work for a while now with Soho House, and that's so it's a mentoring program that spans across lots of different their houses across the UK, and really allows individuals to not just connect with a mentor, but also make all of those, access all of the incredible social capital that's within the walls of Soho House. So they get access, they get membership, and they get access to a mentor. And it's incredible the difference you see and the acceleration of their careers as soon as they have access to that network. So it can be an incredibly accelerating and life-changing experience to have someone who really advocates for you and supports you and helps you deal with all the kind of navigate through all of those complexities. You know, how much do you charge for your, how much day rate, what's your day rate, when are you charging for consultancy, what kind of rate do you charge to who, how do you kind of pitch yourself, all of those things that are really difficult. And I think it is really hard in the, you know, the creative industries has got more self-employed freelance people than any other sector. It's dominated by freelancers, and that so much of that depends on you being able to kind of propel yourself and pitch yourself, and none of that stuff is taught, certainly not taught in schools. And so it's you often find that it's the more kind of confident people who've maybe come from more privileged backgrounds who are able to navigate that landscape much more easily, and that's not fair.
Definitely, and I think just on that, I think it's always really good for you guys to be really proactive, seeking out mentors as well. But I think from an employer's perspective, you know, one thing that we do certainly at Major Players is on your first day you're assigned a buddy who, you know, will take you to, I don't know, where the cool coffee shops, where to get your lunch and things like that. And once you've gone through month one, you will then be assigned a mentor within the organisation, which is really good. Doesn't necessarily have to be from the same department as you, because I think it's all about kind of liaising with other people in different divisions across the business as well. I think it's also really good to then have an external mentor or buddy to speak to. Ultimately, if you and your mentor have the same issues with the same business, it can potentially turn into a little bit of a bitch fest sometimes. So by you having that external person to get a different perspective on everything is really important.
Yeah, cool. And then, so going on to training, how much does training really affect pay? And also, how do those who don't have specific types of training kind of get into that as well?
Yeah, I don't know. Do you want to go first?
I think I can answer it from an employer's side of things more so. I think that, if anything, the last 18 months has just highlighted even more so what training, what support do individuals need to continually grow and progress throughout the business. But I think just in terms of your career as well, not just that particular business that you're working for, but I think as well from you as an individual, it's really important to have, again, that set time with your manager, know what you're aiming for, how to progress there, what are the deliverables that you need to do to, you know, move on to that next stage in your career and how to get there.
Yeah, I was just thinking what we have as an organisation is a budget per employee, and we're beginning to encourage everyone to, like, that they have to spend that every year on training. I think training is so important in terms of progression, particularly at the early stages of your career. I really think I think sometimes it can be, particularly when you're like quite junior, it can be quite intimidating asking to seek out training, because in some way you're potentially admitting that you can't do the job in the way that you would hope. But I think it's actually a very powerful thing to be able to do. And so, yeah, for me, training is really, really important. I mean, one thing I think, so we do, part of the work we do is training, like sort of inclusion training for sort of mid-level employees. So they train with us to become mentors, and then they also go on to be sort of better advocates for inclusion beyond our program. And we so often see people who approach us who are really interested in what we do and really want to get involved, and are really, really, really embarrassed and shy to, like, you know, my employer won't sponsor that. And actually, like, when we then talk directly to the employers, they're very open and very interested in the work we do, and more often than not are very sort of proactive about sponsoring their employees. I think sometimes there's a perception that you shouldn't ask for that kind of extra budget, but actually employers are more and more aware that they need to invest in employees.
Cool. And then going back to diversity, I believe the Major Players survey said that LGBTQIA people earn around 7% less than their heterosexual counterparts. Why do you think more is not done to tackle this?
I think it's really interesting. It was actually a really shocking stat to see that, I think. I think for being a marginalised group, I think perhaps it's the lack of confidence in perhaps negotiating what you're worth. You know, I think it's a real shame that, you know, they might have to feel like they have to negotiate even harder for equal pay. I think actually this should now fall more back upon the employer. Again, it's, have they got clear salary bandings? What is the next step for that person to get to that next level? It just comes back to the whole equal pay, I suppose, regardless of background as well. So.
Yeah, I think also this isn't to do with LGBTQIA, but just to pick up on the salary banding thing, so often we see big organisations who've got huge salary bands at really junior levels of really entry-level positions. And I think just find that ridiculous. What you're going to pay someone at that, at such an entry-level role. There shouldn't be such a big room for exploitation from an employer. I'd like to see that change. That's not to do with the question you just asked, but I just wanted to say that.
But going back to that question, how would you recommend then those marginalised people then raise that conversation?
I think, again, it's, going to your networking events, talking to peers, understanding, the Major Players website has got top tips on negotiating. There's loads of other top tips on, loads of other subjects. I think it's about having enough information to empower you to be able to have that difficult conversation. And I think, if you do work with a recruitment agency, it's not just about finding you a new role. You can always talk to them from a consultative perspective, explain your situation, and that person can also help, coach and advise you on how to handle that conversation as well.
Isabel, anything to add?
I did just have, but it's popped out of my head. I'll come back to it.
Okay, cool. And so I guess creativity can be broken down into so many different sectors. But I think if we look at the marketing, PR, and comms sector, the gender split is 71% female, 28% male, and 1% non-binary. So within a sector like this, what can be done to promote equality?
I think that's definitely really apparent at that kind of junior midweight level, but it actually kind of flips on its head at the slightly more senior level. So once you start looking at kind of 50k plus roles, it's actually probably more male dominated, to be honest. I think what's been really good about the salary survey is that you can actually see that there's so many more females that are entering the creative industry at that kind of junior midweight level. And from the data, it's actually also really highlighted that they're paid more than their male counterparts as well, which is really interesting. And actually really nice to see for once, to be honest. So yeah, I think that's probably what we've got to say on that one.
No, I don't. To that point specifically, no. But I think it's just bringing it back again to socioeconomic diversity. I think it's really interesting that we don't have any stats in this survey, for example, about socioeconomic diversity. It's a huge, it does provide really big barriers to access, and it's not a dimension of diversity that anyone measures. It's not measured in this survey, but it's not, this isn't really unique in that sense. I think the top 50 Diversity Inc., top 50 companies for diversity, not one of them included socioeconomic status as part of their strategic diversity, as part of their diversity strategy. I think I find it really confusing that no one recognises that properly.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. It seems to be the last dimension of diversity that is yet to be discussed, and particularly in the UK, it's hugely significant when we have the kind of a private and state education system that are wildly different in terms of quality. I don't know why it's not more of a significant factor. I think we're just starting to have that conversation. Lots of our partners are beginning to include it in, start to think about working out who they've got, how they represent people socioeconomically, but it's not happening quick enough.
Cool. And so are there any particular companies or parts of the industry which you think are doing well in terms of salary equality?
I think we've got a couple of clients that have just started actually having total transparency on salaries across their organisation. So whether or not you work as a junior account manager or you're the MD or a creative director, you can see everyone's salary in the business, which has actually been going really, really well over the last kind of 9 to 10 months. I think people are just a bit over it. Once you've seen someone's salary, you kind of lose interest to it, but it also gives you the confidence to know that there is equal pay across that business. So I don't know if that's something that could be potentially rolled out across other organisations, or it's again going back to having those clear bandings in organisations. You know, this is the banding for a junior, middleweight, senior weight and upwards.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think like open salary banding is like, I mean, it's like there's loads of research out there that demonstrates that that's the most that's a hugely significant factor to change. I think also, I don't know, organisations that I feel like are doing really good work we work with Sky as one of our partners, and they, I mentioned earlier that I think that support structure, once individuals have passed on from their entry level kind of scheme, I think often the support will completely drop off, and that's when you lose, individuals and start leaving the organisation. They have an incredible support package for like people sort of 5 and 10 years into their career, which I think is really impressive.
But what can? Oh, sorry. No, go for it.
I think if you looked at kind of client side versus agencies, I do think that the client side brands tend to have a better kind of boundary with like equal pay across the organisation.
I was actually going to say, what can other companies learn from that? And also, is there like a negative effect of people knowing everyone's salary in their agency or creative industry too?
I personally don't think so. I find when people start talking about money, everyone kind of gets a little bit awkward, don't they, a little bit? You know, at the end of the day, we all get paid. You know, why is it so awkward for us to kind of speak about this is my salary? You know, I think that is potentially something that people need to get more confident at in terms of talking to each other about, because you will then kind of know more about what your worth is. And I think ultimately it's about organisations actually being on board with it more and actually trying to implement changes across their organisation to help promote this.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like I talk to all my friends about money and earnings. I think it's a really important conversation. It is that people get really uptight about it, and it's like, I guess, traditionally Britishly not very spoken about, but I think that is kind of a mechanism for disparity within pay when you don't talk about it. There's actually, I just bought a really interesting book called We Need to Talk About Money by Atega Uwagba, and I would definitely recommend that to people. It's a really, really interesting read, all about this specifically.
Cool. And so, Edwina, I know you mentioned earlier there's like a massive like hiring spree going on right now. How much of an impact does that have on salary?
I think depending on particular organisations, if they're suddenly going through mass hiring, then they're probably slightly stricter in terms of their budget. So you'll actually find that they will have clearer brackets for individual roles, whereas I think if organisations need like the odd hire, they just kind of throw money at it, whereas if it's multiple hires, they will be much more aware of managing that budget across multiple hires. I think for marginalised groups, it's a really, really exciting opportunity to actually use this kind of boom, I suppose, to your advantage. You know, there is so many roles out there. There's so many organisations that are looking for diversity across their organisations. So again, I think it's about just arming yourself with as much information to have that confidence to kind of go out there. And I think even if it's where you're currently working, knowing by talking to your peers that you're potentially underpaid, having those conversations with your employer, and if they're not willing to entertain it, then now is the best opportunity to kind of just go out there and see what else is around. There's no harm in having conversations. That's just going to boost your confidence, if anything, as well.
Yeah, I've had loads of conversations with some of the young people we work with who've had those conversations with employers and are kind of that sort of decision making, or is like, that's gonna, we'll look at it in a few months. And I just think if people fob you off like that, you should like just leave. I think if it's continually delayed, I think it's just so disrespectful. And so that's the only thing I would add.
Cool. And then just wrapping up, so looking at the major players survey, was there anything from there that really stood out to you, and why?
I think just the fact that females, and particularly black females, get paid nearly 20 grand less than their white male counterparts. It's just, I mean, you always knew about it, but then I think when you actually see it from research and data, it's just really quite shocking. Why is it still like it? You know, we've been talking about it for so long. You know, I think everyone just needs to start making a change and moving forward.
Yeah, I think that for me, that was the thing that stuck out the most as well. And I think, again, like, it's just not, it's like, why is this still a problem? Again, sorry to talk loads about this guy, Sam Friedman, who I mentioned earlier, but he's also done he's written a really cool book, which I would encourage everyone to read, called The Class Ceiling. And he talks about how individuals, when you look at, like, Russell Group universities, for example, individuals who are from more privileged backgrounds, and got 2-2s at the same universities as those from poorer backgrounds who got firsts, go on to get paid more. So, like, even if you got a worse, you know, if you're from a certain background and you get a worse qualification at the same university, you still go on to earn more. And so if that's, you know, that's still happening, you know, it's really unsurprising when we see things like that come out of the major players survey. So again, it's just another argument why we should be sort of measuring socioeconomic diversity as a metric, as a dimension of diversity.
What can people do in the future to ensure that that is measured then?
They can campaign for it if they think that their employer could add it to their, you know, most employers will have surveys where they try and figure out who they're representing within their organisation, and it's so rare that they add kind of, I think it's difficult to, like, a lot of people are really unsure about what questions to ask. Like, do you ask about family income? Do you ask about accessibility to free school meals? Or did you go to state school? There's a really interesting, like, if anyone in here is an employer and is thinking about it, there's a really useful thing that came, that the Bridge Group put out a report with a list of questions that you can ask that help you sort of figure out who you're representing in your organisation. So I would recommend looking there, or, like, come and ask me afterwards. But yeah, I think it's a bit like that conversation about money. Like, people are reticent in the UK, I think, to talk about money and class, but they exist and they're very prevalent. And so I think we do need to have that conversation.
I think also it's, again, just talking to your peers. You know, there'll probably be multiple people in the organisation with, you know, sometimes a similar background to you, but, you know, who are also really empowered by it and want to make a change. So it's about kind of rallying the troops together, because then you will be able to be a voice to that organisation, which might, you know, could get them to pay more attention to you, rather than you being one individual person trying to make a difference alone. There will be other people that want to support you with that.
Yeah, I think also industry bodies have a role to play. Like, I know the IPA has just started talking, like, they've released a module, or they're releasing a module about socioeconomic status. So it is changing, but you know, that's slow.
Is there ever the worry that those things just become tick boxing exercises then?
I think in the past it's potentially felt a little bit like it's a tick boxing exercise, whereas now I think, especially over the last 18 months, it's highlighted it more than ever, where I feel like people are actually wanting to make a change. I think, you know, there's no responsibility that lies on one particular person, whether it's you as a candidate, an employee, or an employer, or an industry body. I think the responsibility lies across everybody. And, you know, I think it's brands need to demand it from their agencies need to demand it from, like, their recruiters, and industry bodies need to demand it from all of their members. So I think it falls across everybody to do something about it now.
Yeah, weirdly, I think actually there was a risk of it becoming very much like this. I feel like maybe 2 years ago there were endless panel discussions about this kind of thing, and about accessibility, and I feel this is a bit ironic because it's a panel discussion and we're talking about this, but like, since the pandemic and all of the incredible, like, amazing social justice movement that happened, resulting from the Black Lives Matter movement, I feel like a lot of companies are starting to really take this much more seriously, and we've certainly seen, like, you know, our model as a charity is that we work in partnership with creative industry companies who sponsor the work we do, and we've experienced so much more interest and so many more partnership opportunities since in the last year. So that's really positive. So I'd say actually where perhaps that was the case a few years ago, things are definitely changing for the better. And there's a lot more pressure as well from employees within the organisation at, upwards to a senior level. There's so much more pressure on that. Purpose is so important for employees now that I think if it's not, they don't see their values represented in the organisation, they will just leave. And I think employers are aware of that.
Is there a longevity within that though? Because I know some companies, especially big ones, have a quota per se of how many X, Y, and Z people they should hire. So once they've hired those people, what happens after that?
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to know what you think. But so for me, we're having more and more conversations now with organisations who are thinking more about progression, not just access, about progression as well. So I mentioned Wyden Kennedy, but there are lots of other conversations we're having with organisations who are, it doesn't make sense for them either to focus just on access, so that people, they hire all this amazing talent and then they leave because they don't feel comfortable. I think it is more and more an awareness that you need to support people beyond just those entry-level roles.
Yeah, and I think, it shouldn't be a quota of, that's how many people we need in the business. That should be the bare-ass minimum of how many people we need in the business. And then it's just actually about promoting that and continually to hire from diverse backgrounds across the organisation as well.
Cool. Any questions? Oh, no, I can repeat. Oh.
I've said so many statistics. So maybe yeah. Sorry. No, you go.
From a recruitment side of things, I hate it every time a client says to me that they want someone with a university background. I just think it's ridiculous. Why can you not take someone who's got, 5-6 years work experience and is probably even better at the role versus someone who's been at uni? Yes, they've got a degree. I think it's about the experience, and I personally think it's something that I totally disagree when someone asks me if they need a university degree. I will really push back on the client and sometimes may not even work on those roles if they're completely inflexible with it. I've got so many clients sometimes that are must have been a red brick university as well, and you're just why? Really? As if. So I think it's, it's something from recruitment agencies we certainly push back to our clients on.
That's really good to hear. I think as well, so the point about kind of Russell brick or red brick universities, clients specifying that is really annoying. But the other thing is that's so frustrating about it is just coming at it from an education. So I was a teacher for about 4 years. And actually, the huge majority of our students ended up going to university, but not necessarily because it was the right decision for them, but because that was the message that we were kind of force-feeding them, that get your GCSE results, get your A-level results, and then go to university, and then think about your career. And it's so short-sighted because that's not how it works. We then have students who leave university with no idea about the world or the job that they want to go into, and 50 grand in debt, and haven't probably got a degree from the kind of university that sets them up for success. It's just that kind of, for me, is the most insidious part of it, that we are, and that's a kind of initiative I think that I guess it was part of Tony Blair's 50% of the population will go to university. I think actually a huge percentage of the young people that we work with do go to university now, but I would say that they're left at a disadvantage because of it, and that for me is the really frustrating thing. Well, That's a really good question. There is there's more, like the apprenticeship levy for me is a really positive thing. So we're seeing like more weight given to apprenticeships and gradually mindsets are changing. So that's a really positive thing. And I don't know, it seems to me that like those often who are from more privileged backgrounds feel more confident to be able to say, actually, I'm not going to go to university, I'm going to go straight into work in a weird kind of, the weird world that we live in. So the answer, I think, is more emphasis on apprenticeships and routes into employment that aren't through degrees. Because also it's such a waste of I don't know, some of the degrees that some of our young people have come away with and the experiences that they've had, it's just like it's not worth that money sometimes. Obviously depends on what you want to do, but as you say, like you don't need a degree for most of the jobs. Sorry, really ranty.
I think we've got time for one more question. We've got 1 minute left.
Don't vote for the Conservative government because they have because they're desperate to try and they have this idea of like a curriculum that is like a knowledge-based curriculum where you have to everybody has to know who like Miss Havisham is. Like it's a travesty if people don't know what 1066 is significant for. So for them, education is very much about inhaling information and being able to regurgitate it in written format in an exam. And actually, since their government, they've reduced so many good things that were in the curriculum. Like I used to teach English, and speaking and listening was a part of the English course. So there was one part of the curriculum where you had to you had to kind of present and you had to talk, and that was really important. And that's been scrapped now, and there is not one opportunity in the curriculum that's part of the curriculum for students to demonstrate their speaking and their oracy. So and then that's a huge part of the work. If you're in an organisation, you have to present your ideas. It's so important, and everything they do is about written work now. So it's just depressing. I don't know. Sorry, that's really.
I'm just going to add on that. I think for us, from Major Players, from a recruitment perspective, yes, we go to some universities for graduates to kind of educate them on what the creative industry looks like. Can we help you with your CVs? But actually to help with the confidence side of things for those that don't want to go to universities, we've actually started going into senior schools now as well to kind of help educate them in terms of what their next levels are. This is what the creative industry is, because obviously we cover everything across the industry as well. So I think maybe it's just more about recruitment companies going into that, maybe even organisations like clients and advertising agencies going into those kind of schools to promote it from themselves as well.
Yeah, so I'm just going to really quickly add that I'm really bad at talking about Creative Mentor Network, which is the organisation that I run, but the whole point of what we do is to match up school-age students and just above with agencies and creative industry organisations. So we run a mentoring programme that matches up those two communities, and it's very much focused on developing soft skills and confidence and teamwork and stuff like that. So yeah, if you're that is a really good route to go down if you're a young person looking to develop those skills. So yeah.
Perfect. Thank you both.